linguistic diversity and collaboration among freshman year composition students and the inclusive promise of peer review. My name is Dr. Raymond Levy, and I'm a visiting assistant teaching professor at the Florida International University. And with me is my co-presenter.
Hi, my name is Ticha Ho, and then I'm a lecturer in the Writing and Critical Inquiry program at the State University of New York at Albany, in Albany, New York.
So before we get into the details of the study, I want to give some institutional background along with theoretical background and a bit of detail on the study design, which we'll do now. Now, the institutional background where I initially conducted the research was at a mid-sized private research university, hereafter referred to as MSPRU, in a diverse metropolitan area of the southeastern United States, which runs integrated mainstream English language composition sections. MSPRU enrolled over 1,100 international students in fall 2017, at which time Hispanic students comprised over as cited in MSPRU Office of Institutional Effectiveness handbook published in 2018. So a bit on theoretical background to aid in the objective of interpreting the relationship of these ideologies with an impact on students from diverse language backgrounds. I conceptualized a framework of workshop participants engaging with translingual literacy on a spectrum drawing from Guerra's 2016A Continuum of Ideological Responses to Language and Cultural Difference, including monolingualism, multilingualism, and translingualism as ideological approaches. Building on Horner et al.'s 2011 delineation of responses to language difference and their elaboration on translingualism as being, quote, about the disposition of openness and inquiry that people take toward language, end quote, the framework assists to theorize the extent to which the peer review process serves a bridging of differences based on observing how participants employ attitudes and dispositions in the form of responsive approaches to language difference. And next, we have the study design, which you can see there, looking at how students make meaning from their peer review collaborations and elucidating their workshop-linked activities. I studied the contribution of 5, including 2 multilingual and 3 monolingual individuals' ideological responses to language difference around the setting of 2 workshops through interpretivist participant observation research design. The confluence of data sources consisted of answers to email question forms on prior experiences of peer review responses in the form of drafts, revisions, and final drafts, as well as observations of workshops and semi-structured interviews, both of relevant workshop participants and their instructor. To assess the effect of language ideologies, content analysis was conducted, coding data for themes based on patterns emerging from the information. Now, a bit about this data analysis on the next slide here, and the results. So while the greater critical awareness that comes with recognizing peer review workshops as a vehicle for variety in language practices can be thought of as itself portending a translingual disposition, interpretive analysis of themes emerging from the data indicates the complexity of the understandings toward linguistic diversity that participants demonstrated in the variety of the ideological approaches to language difference they drew upon in practicing peer review activities. The interactively non-fixed shaping of language practices by ideological stances was evidenced in this study through 3 sets of categorical themes in the data. The first set consisting of participants' approaches toward peer review as a means of greater understanding, the consequences of being judgmental of others' capability based on their writing, and individual ownership of writing. The second set consisting of the degree of communicative directness and empathy evident to one extent or another, and the third set consisting of the range of ways in which students implemented language ideologies in practice during peer review as a consequence of context in relation to the 3 ideological approaches to language difference during workshops examined for this study. In this way, as you can see on this table here, the first thematic data set consisted of participants' understandings of language difference. The second, their implementation of language difference understandings in response to peers' work. And the third, their language difference understanding and collaboration. Systematically, the categorical sets are overlapping, interdependent stages of peer review in a recursive process of exchanging ideas. The stance a peer reviewer brings toward language employment impacts your indication to a peer of the other's quality of language use, and feedback is implemented responsibly. So for the next slide, we'll take a look at the results and findings of this initial study. Right, so if we go back to the previous slide here, right, so you'll see these are basically quotes from student interviews and testimonials that were conducted and collected during the study. Rather than just conceptualizing approaches to language difference as competitively exhibited by different individuals, the data analyzed suggests they can be considered as on a spectrum, gradations of which the language user attends to adaptively at certain moments. Thinking of them in the context of peer review as orientations that vie for attention of students implemented in the form of collaborative activities accords with Horner et al.'s 2011 explanation that, quote, a translingual approach takes a variety, fluidity, intermingling, and changeability of languages as statistically demonstrable norms. However, it's a translingualism more in line with Guerra's 2016 statement that for students to, quote, call on the rhetorical sensibilities many of them already possess, end quote. It puts into sharper focus Guerra's notion of a continuum as a spectrum of potential responses along with individual treatment of three ideological approaches toward linguistic and cultural difference, being indicative of engaging language ideologies and understanding of linguistic diversity in practice. So, for instance, through the quotes, or though the quotes here all come from the same monolingual English-speaking student, the approaches toward responding to language difference that they indicate are different in each case. While the third quote here, that it's more productive than if we were just using class time to work on our essay, we could do that elsewhere. We might as well get a second opinion and get feedback on it as opposed to just looking at your own writing and revising it yourself. That translingual stance, given the productive manner in which the student attempted to make meaning of peers' writing. Her appreciation for the effort, however, it took for second language learners to write in another language is found in the second quote on the bottom left here, that I wouldn't be able to do that, to write that well, if I wasn't writing in my native language. So if anything, I was more impressed after reading it. And that's indicative of a multilingual approach, stressing distinctness of language proficiency. Yet her phrasing of certain points as sounding weird in this first quote, right, the remaining one, if something sounds weird in sentence structure, that might involve a switch of two words. That speaks to a certain monolingual-centric emphasis on correctness in feedback to her ESL peer, which, while direct, contrasted sharply with his indirectness in his comments toward her work. Overall, then, study findings suggest students collaborating with people of diverse backgrounds draw on a variety of stances toward language difference, signaling that participants can be guided to recognize their own stances toward language difference when needed. And next, we'll hear from Tisha on the study's transferability and implications. And in particular, if we go to the next slide, she'll give a look at the study's transferability or collected in another similarly linguistic diverse institution with analysis derived from quoting students' peer responses, workshops, and reflections.
Hi, so after talking to Raymond about his idea, and then I was thinking about how could I use that idea to implement that in my classroom. I teach in the program in writing and critical inquiry at University of Albany. And then, so even though like we are not like a typical composition class, we emphasize on the idea of inquiry. So like having encouraging students to ask questions, that what we focus on. And then so because my program only have we just want people to do a personal essay, analysis, and conversations, and that pretty much what we have to decide curriculum to fit that. So I decided to do the peer review during the second essay of the rhetorical analysis essay, because at least student has some kind of at least one experience with peer review before they get to the second part. Okay, so like in my this background of my student, so I have 6 international students, and they all have English as a second language. They don't. So these the countries actually, these actually represent the country where they come from. So like I have some student from Asia, then like some student from Europe, and then some student from Africa. And then so they don't have formal English writing instructions. Most of them only have perhaps taking a TOEFL, and then this will be, so I was like that first English writing teacher. They don't have shared language, like so English would actually be the language they actually share between them. And they also don't have any prior experience before, like with peer review before that, before they take my class. So, like with guidance from Raymond, Raymond like decide these questions, and then so I send them almost like a reflection question before we do the peer review. So the question 1 asks, how do you see yourself in the workshop? How do you think others see you in this workshop? How do you see the role that the other plays in this workshop? What do you see in the role? What do you see the role being workshop participants? What's it like being around multilingual English language learners in your groups? And the last one was what is it like being around monolingual English language learners in your groups? So for question 6, as I was talking to Raymond, I think we were kind of thinking about if they have to be interacting with monolingual English language learners, like outside of outside of class. So I think like what is really interesting to me was like as trying to implement Raymond's idea was that like these 2 reflective questions, like how they relate to you, and so like kind of like these 2 questions in the sense that kind of like asking to students to reflect more on their experience and how they how they think about the idea of being multilingual, monolingual, and translingual. So this is what is the study findings of what I have that what students say. So most of them seem to be positive toward peer review. Christina with she's from Nepal, and then she said since I give in-depth feedback that correspond with their respective work, I believe that others see me as helpful guidance in this workshop. Minji from Korea. She said she see multilingualism as the theme is that she see multilingualism as advantage. Minji said I'm multilingual English learner, so it make me more comfortable and continuously find something that I can learn from them. And lastly, some of them actually do, not that everything is positive, right? So like some of them actually say that they question the usefulness of the peer review process. Umid from Turkey, he said some of them, the classmates, don't pay attention to the lessons. And I think like that kind of like take me to this so pretty much like Sandy don't have the previous background with like doing peer review, so and I always have to figure it out like every semester, how do I sell this idea of peer review to students, especially in the challenges I have like in my student population, just that like there's no monolingual English native speaker who would actually kind of say, oh, this is the way things should be, right? So like how did like these interactions, so that's why like, when I get to the peer review in my class, I really have to really emphasize on the usefulness of this peer review process, which is like, very important in writing study.
And I think what Tisha's findings also illustrate in terms of the implications is how peer review can be used as an exchange of ideas, right? So one student was talking about how it helped, right? Another student was talking about the differences in language, and the other student was saying that it wasn't useful at all. And so to me, that almost coincides nicely, or maybe not so nicely, with the idea of the ideological approaches to language difference, right? Monolingualism, not seeing the usefulness, multilingualism, seeing it but being separate, right? A distinctness of language, and then translingualism really getting into what the students are trying to make meaning out of, right? What they're trying to get out of the experience. So using peer review as a pedagogical tool and this data to help us do that. In this representation, the understandings of language difference each peer review participant brings affects implementation of language difference understandings in response to another's work. Feedback, which then impacts collaboration through means of revision. Like Guerra's posited continuum, the process is not cut and dried. Depending on the circumstances, a step in the process might influence another, as well as impact an individual's approach to peer review from then on. Peer review can thus be established as a space conducive to translingualism in an expansive approach that can assist students to harness their stances to language difference in an accessible manner. Citing Feist, Bowser, and Reisenauer from 2013, Kanagaraja 2018b applies their distinction of place from space. And this is what he writes, quote, while place is a geographical entity identified by physical boundaries and governed by the nation state, space is liminal. It is socially constructed and effectively experienced. From this perspective, one doesn't have to leave one's usual habitation to adopt a transnational positioning, end quote. Conceptually, the data suggests that the idea of space works specifically as a metaphor through which to envision writing in terms of involving a relationship with one's surroundings, whether separate and apart from them or immersed in and a part of them, to the extent that language users bring their experiences in other places to bear on their literacy practices. Preconceptions participants brought with them influenced their collaboration at least partly, given that they were able to negotiate with each other by calling on their understandings of language difference resourcefully. For composition as a field, then, making explicit the idea of space and its interplay with approaches to language difference as a framework in diverse settings can help students become more strategically self-aware of how communicative resources at one's disposal of equity. So that's it from me. Right?
Yeah, I mean, just like I guess like one of them, like after having to like try to implement this idea in my classroom, right? And also like from your study finding also, I think what's really interesting is the idea that like how people kind of shift between different stances, like at certain times, and also kind of I mean, I could see that like with in my student context, like student actually can mean like very different, like varying degree of English, like speaking levels, and it's like capacity, like they actually speak in English different levels, right? So I guess like what I can see from my like from even like one student actually from Nigeria, which like English was his first language, and there was also still the idea of how do I say this? Yeah, I guess I guess what I'm trying to say, they ship between sometimes is, they want to do some, they kind of look at it almost like, I know more English than you do type of thing, right? But then, it sounds like, but I guess like from, in my context, what unique about it is so much there's really kind of like coming together and sharing of ideas and what language could be, because none of us besides of the student from Nigeria, that none of us actually the English was our first language at all.
See, so that's why I thought it was interesting that from my findings to highlight how the same person can at different times think about it in a variety of ways. But what that tells me, and maybe what it could imply for us as a field, is that we have to help them make that explicit in their thinking, right? So they realize and they become aware of those moves more consciously. And in that way, they can understand, okay, well, maybe this is a way that I'm thinking about it now, but since I have to figure out how to make meaning out of it, right, then I can try to view the experience more productively and ultimately, hopefully, learn something from it, right, which is ultimately right, and that makes it more of a positive experience overall.
Yeah, but I think from what you found in your study, also besides the shift that between different orientations, I think there's also kind of that reflection, that why I was pointing out to the reflection question, that kind of asking students kind of reflect on what's it like to be multilingual, what's it like to be monolingual, or what is it like, do you feel like going to the English only policy, or I am the native English speaker stance. But I guess it's that realization that I think when you ask students to kind of reflect on that, I think it helps to think about English being multilingual as as an asset, and because I think what I saw from the code that you pointed out, that the person said, well, I wouldn't be able to write in my second language as well, which I would say I think give credit to the to the multilingual students also, right? And then I think that create empathy. I think what I'm getting from your data.
Right, definitely, and cultivating that, exactly, and knowing that their viewpoints and their outlooks can have an effect on. So that's why I think kind of Garaja's distinction between space and place is important, right? Or how he uses that, because in that way, peer review can be, even though it's in a school setting where traditionally it's about correctness, right? Whereas maybe if they're at home, they feel more comfortable, code switching and all of that. Whereas if they're out in public, at a, either at the grocery store or or they might think of language as a matter of understanding each other, but using specific grammatical conventions for different languages, right? So it's all about how so even though if they might be in school, if they have a more positive outlook toward it, then that might try to make meaning and negotiate those ideas among each other. Great. So I think that's pretty much it, right? Unless you have any other
Yeah, so
suggestions?
if you have like any question about our presentations, you can email Raymond. That is Raymond's email is on the screen, and then my email is there. And then so these are the references that you can, that Raymond mentioned in his in the presentations. And I guess like what it comes to it, like what I'm gonna kind of go back to the title of the presentation, right? So I think like so this like like shifting between like the different stances and kind of thinking more about like multilingual students, and I guess that like that kind of empathy that like like go with the idea of like kind of realizing and asking students to reflect on the linguistic diversity, and then like like what I remember saying that the idea of like going to the collaboration in classrooms, could think about peer review more like being inclusive, like as opposed to just like a class activity that like students feel like it's a chore that they have to do it. Right.
Great.
So I think
Thank you so much.
thank you for like watching our presentations.